friends, welcome to my channel, or welcome back if you are new. I am Neva. This is Reading with Neva, where we talk all things books, mom life, and cozy hobbies. Today's video is going to be a little bit different than what I usually upload here. So I have been on BookTube now for 3 years. I've been on YouTube itself longer than that, because I started in the planning community, but as far as being a part of the YouTube book community, it's been just over 3 years. And this weekend is Mother's Day. So for anyone who does not know, the Saturday before Mother's Day every year is Birth Mother's Day. And since I am both things, I thought I would come and tell a story time, I guess, that I've actually never shared on my channel. I have talked about being a birth mother. I've talked about the fact that I have children that were adopted, but I've never given a lot of details or really talked about how it influenced me or like the choices I've made in life. So I thought that we would come on this Birth Mother's Day of 2025 and I would talk about it. So I'm not going to give a lot of detail as to how my children came to be adopted. That's still not really a thing that I want to share on the internet, just simply because I guess if you looked hard enough, you could figure it out. But also, that was a very dark time for me, so it's not really something that I want to share. But I will say that it had nothing to do with drugs or alcohol. A lot of people assume this about me because I've also shared that I have struggled with drug addiction in the past, which is true. However, that is not the reason that my children ended up being adopted. The long and short of it is that there were some lies that were told and DCF was involved, and ultimately the best option after struggling with the system for 18 months was to let them stay with their foster placement, who is now their mom. I also will not be saying their names on this video. If I need, I probably will use their initials because there are 3 children that are involved in this story. So the only child whose name will be used in this story, if it's relevant, is Ari's, and that is simply because people already know who she is. I also will not be using the name of their mom, of the boy's mom. So for context, my older children are 13, 11, and 10. So for that, I will be using their initials. So my oldest will be H, my middle son will be G, and my youngest son will be C, and then their mom will be A, if it's relevant to use initials. So I think that mostly this video will be me talking about how having children adopted has impacted my life. So we're technically, my journey with foster care and adoption started in 2014. So technically it started in 2014, August of 2014. So I had my youngest son, C. He was born, and then 1 week later they came and picked up the children. They had already removed my middle child, G, for reasons that I'm not really sure on the internet. So they had already removed him due to the lies that had been told and the misunderstandings of what was happening. No one wanted to listen to me, of course, because I was the person under investigation. That's how it works. And then a week after that, they came and picked up the oldest and the youngest. So after the children were removed, I decided that I no longer wanted to live with my youngest's biological father. So at that time I was living with him, and I'm not going to use his name to protect the innocent or not so innocent. I actually won't be using any of the fathers' names in this. There are two fathers, so my older two children have their dad, and then my youngest son has his, and then Ari has her own dad, who is not the dad that the internet knows. Like, she has a biological father who is not the person that I refer to as Ari's dad. So after they were removed, I decided I didn't want to live with him anymore. I did have to deal with some a more legal side of DCF, so like the police. So I couldn't move out right away because of dealing with that. However, I ended up making an arrangement and made myself homeless for all intents and purposes. I ended up going to the Salvation Army, and I stayed there for, well, so the Salvation Army at the time had two programs. They had what they called the overnight program, which was essentially you would go there, you would have to check in by a certain time. I think it was like 4 p.m. I guess for context, I lived in Florida at this time, so I don't know, like in the Daytona Beach area, so I don't know what other states for Salvation Army would look like, but in Daytona Beach, it looked like this. I don't know how it looks now. I know that they've done some overhauling, so I don't know if it's still the same or not. But at that time, you would check in at, I think it was 4 p.m. And then you'd go in, and once you came in, you were not really supposed to leave after that, because they didn't give you like lockers or anything like that. So your possessions were like your responsibility, right? So you could come in, you could check in, or maybe you could leave. I don't remember, but you came in, I think you could leave once you were checked in, because they wrote your name down. So you'd come in, you would check in, and you would go into like a dorm setting, and there were two dorms depending on which side you stayed on. So women stayed on one side and men stayed on the other. There were two different dorms, and then those dorms were split in half. So the overnight women would stay on one side, and like once you went in the dorm, and the street team women or the long stay women would stay on the other side. So as a overnight person, which I did that for, I think the cap was like 90 days or something, so I ended up doing the whole 90 days. But you had to come in and you had to take everything that you had with you every day, because you weren't guaranteed a bed. You were only guaranteed a bed if you could make it through the door as one of the first, I think it was like 12 or 15 people, right? So they had like 12 women and 12 men. We'll just say that. I don't remember exactly how many it was, but as long as you were the first of one of those groups, then you would have a bed. But you weren't guaranteed a bed, not like the long stay people. So I did the overnight program for the 90 days. I basically, my life lived in a backpack. At that time, I was taking a couple of like courses. They weren't classes, but they were courses over at the college and at Daytona State. And so basically my clothes would go down, like every morning I would get up and I would pack my clothes back up into my my bag. So they had showers there and they had laundry there. So I was able to utilize the laundry and the showers. So at that time, you wouldn't have even known that I was homeless, but this is why this has no relevance, but this is actually why now I take 1 to 2 showers per day, because when you live in Florida and you're outside all the time, you sweat a lot. And when I stayed at Salvation Army for the first 90 days, I was outside a lot because I couldn't be at the Salvation Army during the day. If you're an overnight person, you can't just hang out there. So when I was doing the overnight program, I was on the beach or I was at the library, but I was constantly not in, like, I always had my backpack with me. My back was always sweaty, like, and even if I took the bus everywhere, but even if I was taking the bus, like, the bus, yes, has air conditioning, but like with all those bodies on it, it can be hot. People that are like the homeless population that lived on the street, it was a little bit harder, I think, for them to care or to find showers. There were places sprinkled throughout Daytona Beach that would allow you to shower for free if you were part of the homeless population. So the buses were like smelly as well. So like I just always felt gross by the end of the day. So that's where like my showering habit comes in, and I'm very well aware of that, but it is just who I am at this point. So that would happen. So basically we'd have to take everything. So that included any pillows or blankets that we had. So I carried like a travel pillow in my backpack. I had a really big backpack. It was like not a camping backpack, but it was definitely like a big like school style backpack where I could put like my school books in one spot, because I was taking a couple courses, my clothes in another spot, but that way I had room for like a small travel pillow and a blanket that was big enough for me to sleep under. So it wasn't like a comforter or anything, but it was a big enough blanket I could sleep under it. More like a throw blanket almost. And then all of the rest of my stuff was packed away in a closet at A's house, at my son's mom's house. So at this time they were still just foster placements, but she and I had, we had talked about what would happen if I couldn't get them back, and we had pretty much decided that they would stay with her if I couldn't, but we were only 90 days into this. So after the 90 days, I was able to apply for the street team program. This was a long-term stay program that I think it was 12 men and 12 women, if I remember correctly. And the caveat to this was that you had to go clean the streets in the morning. So we would get up at like 6 a.m., eat breakfast, and then by 7, you would be out on the street beautifying Daytona Beach. So we had, I think there were no, couldn't have been 3. Let's see, 6 different routes. There had to have been, yeah, because there were usually 4 of us to a team, and there were like 24 of us, I'm pretty sure. So like in total. So there would be 2 men and 2 women to each team, and you'd go out with like a trash picker, like the one that had, like you would clamp it, and it had a clamp on the end. It wasn't like a stabby one. So you like squeeze the handle and it would like clamp things. So there were like 6 different routes that you could take, and you got a different route every week. Not every day, but every week. Your team would stay the same for that week. So your route and your team would stay the same for 1 week, and then it would switch. So you were never with the same people every single week, but sometimes like you'd have like double ups. Like sometimes I'd be on a team with someone like twice in a row or whatever. So that program, I think, was 2 years. I think you could do street team for up to 2 years. So the caveat was that you either had to be doing street team, or you had to be working full-time or going to school full-time. So you had to be doing something else outside of street team if you weren't going to do street team. So the entire time that I was there, I did street team until I started doing my GED, and then when I started doing my GED, I was able to leave street team because my GED program started at 8 o'clock. Now, I did not graduate with my GED during this time. I ended up having some trouble with like the math section of it. And so it was taking me much longer. And then eventually I met Ari's biological dad in the street team program, and we decided to move out. So we moved out. I think I'd been there like 1.5 years. Now in this time frame, no, I hadn't. I'd been there, actually when I met him, I think I'd been there 6 months. I ended up being there for a total of like a year-ish. And I didn't end up having to go back. So there is a resurgence problem, or there was, with that program. I don't think that program even exists anymore. in Daytona Beach, but there was kind of like a re-entry problem with that program, kind of like with like jail, where sometimes people would leave, like a lot of times people would leave and then they'd find their way back, and they'd leave and find their way back. I never ended up having to go back. However, I did have a relapse during that time, and they threatened me with putting me into the rehab side of the Salvation Army. So there was a rehab side. I don't really know anything about it because we weren't, as people that stayed on like the homeless side of Salvation Army, we were not allowed to talk to them. So there were actually 4 programs being run at the time that I was staying at Salvation Army. So there was the 2 that I've already said. So the overnight program, the street team program, and then there was a rehab program and a work release program. So if you don't know what work release is, it's like when you go to jail and then they will like let you out to work. So there were 2 different ways in Florida that you could do work release. You could either stay at the jail, so you would like go to the jail at nighttime. You would sleep there and then you would leave during the day. There was a bus that would take you like from the jail. And then there was a work release program that was closer to like a parole program, where you would be released to like the Salvation Army or another like halfway house style place, and they would allow you to leave during the day to work or to find work. So I was not allowed, like we were not technically allowed to talk to them, because they were like actually dealing, most of them, with like the law. So we were not supposed to talk to them or hang out with them. Ari's biological dad started, biological father, I don't even want to call him a dad, to be honest, because he's not one, but he started in the overnight program. So I would see him like passing through and stuff like that. The overnight people were allowed to use like the TV room and stuff like that we used as street team people. Their curfew was just earlier than ours. So like I would see him like pass through or whatever, and then he had said something to one of my friends who I always call her my I always call her my Salvation Army mom. I still talk to her actually, like to this day. Absolutely love her. I'm not gonna say her name on the internet, but if she sees this by some miracle, I just want her to know that I love her. And he had said something to her about me, and like I had like seen him and I thought that he was like attractive, whatever. I was relatively young at the time. I think I was 24. Yeah, I think I was 24. Because I had Ari when I was 26. So I would have been like 23 or 24. And I was I was very street smart at 24. Or not street smart, I'm sorry. I was very book smart at 24. I was not super street smart. I had always been in long-term relationships. I either like wasn't in relationships or I was in long-term relationships. There was no like in between. And at that point, the only like true long-term relationship I had been in was with H and C's biological dad. They have the same dad. And that relationship was not necessarily like the best. I mean, we were both using substances at that time. Like we both had addiction issues. I had quit using for some time after the kids were born, and then I had I relapse during the time of me being at Salvation Army, which I can talk about that. So my relapse was alcohol because that's what I could get. It was not my drug of choice. It was not, alcohol had never been an issue for me. I wasn't even really a huge fan of alcohol outside of like wine. But back then the Four Locos were still the old recipe. So if you don't know anything about Four Loko, they are like a sugary energy, like alcoholic energy drink. And at that time, they were still made with an obscene amount of caffeine in them. Like the Four Locos were killing people. That's just like what it is. And because of that, I was like, oh, okay, well, this is easy because we could buy them at 7-Eleven. This is how I know I was over the age of 21, because I could just like go in and buy things. Because I moved to Florida when I think I had just turned 22 when I moved to Florida. Yeah. Or I was almost 22 when I moved to Florida. Like, I was not very old, but I was over the age of 21. So we could go into 7-Eleven. We could buy, which is where we all frequented, because 7-Eleven had pizza and they had like other like food there. And of course the gas station. So we could go to 7-Eleven, buy Four Loko, and then they would allow us to take the styrofoam cups of ice. So we would pay, I think it was like 25 cents for a styrofoam cup of ice, pour the Four Loko into the styrofoam cups, and then we could walk on the beach without getting in trouble for carrying alcohol. So on Daytona Beach, you can't have alcohol containers on the beach, so they don't want you to have cans or glass bottles. So a lot of people, that's like how like Brewmate came to be. I love that company, by the way, but that's how things like Brewmate came to be, because they were making containers, drink containers that you could pour alcohol into, and still like they're still allowed like out on beaches and things like that and in parks. So we were allowed to have these styrofoam cups, right? So we would pour them into cups and do that. I am not quite sure how much I drank that night. I believe I drank the equivalent of 1.5 Four Locos, which at that time I was like 95 pounds. I was not super healthy at that time. I was very thin and I was sick a lot. This was like when my chronic pain had really started to catch up, but I didn't know it was chronic pain. And so like keeping weight on was really hard for me. Functioning daily was really hard for me. I was also dealing with a lot of mental health stuff that I was trying to just like kind of like raw dog at the time. Like, I wasn't on any medications or anything like that because I was scared to take them. But the relapse for me was a wake-up call because it was scary. I ended up, I don't know how I got from the beach side of Daytona back to the Salvation Army. There's a bridge that we would walk across. It was a small bridge. We actually called it the small bridge. And you would walk that bridge and it would take you across because there was a footpath on each side, and then the cars would go down the middle of the bridge. I don't know how I made it across that bridge over to back to Salvation Army. I remember being on the beach, and then I remember being at Salvation Army. I remember Salvation Army mom seeing me and being like, are you okay, blah, blah, blah. And she was like, okay, well, you're just gonna go in and you have to go like straight to bed. There were a couple of the guards that I was like, security guards that I was like friendly with or whatever. One of them was relatively young, like he was around the same age that like my age, and so I think there was a little like there was like a flirtation thing that went on there. That's not great, okay, but there was like a flirtation thing. I could get away with things sometimes if I like flirted with this dude, and he would kind of allow it. He happened to be the security guard on duty that night, so he didn't even write me up. He just looked at me and he said, go to bed, like, do not pass go, do not collect $200, do not go to the TV room. And he looked at my Salvation Army mom and was like, you need to take her straight to bed. Absolutely not. So I went to bed that night. I remember that she had to help me up onto my bunk because I shared a bunk with her, like with my Salvation Army mom. She slept on the bottom because at the time there was, when I first got to Salvation Army on that side of the program, she had like broken her leg or her ankle or something, and she couldn't get to the top bunk. So she needed someone who could sleep on her top bunk. So that was how we ended up being bunkmates. Plus we like got along. She had to basically push me up onto the top bunk. I woke up the next morning, raging hangover, and I had to go talk to, I don't think he'll mind me saying his name on the internet, but I had to go talk to Mr. Don, who was the caseworker for street team, and he basically told me, you can leave, or you can go to the rehab side, or you can go to NA. This is the time that we leave for the NA meetings. He would take us on Mondays and Thursdays, I think it was. I know Mondays. But he would take us on Mondays and he would buy everyone Dunkin' Donuts coffee. You could get whatever you wanted. You could get one drink of whatever you wanted at Dunkin'. And we would take like the Salvation Army bus, which was like a shorter bus. It was like the smaller bus. And we would, you had to be on the bus by 5:59, not a minute later than that. He would pull up in front at 5:45, and you had until 5:59 to be on the bus. He was leaving at 5:59. If he left it, if you were not on that bus by 5:59, he was leaving you behind, because he left at exactly 6 p.m. That gave us time to go get Dunkin' and do all the things we need to do, and then get to the meeting by 7. So that was basically what that was. Plus, like, he wanted us to have time to like mingle with like the people at NA. So usually we would get there about 6:30, and then the meeting started at 7. We would go over at 8. We would all leave, all that. So yeah, so I chose to go to NA. So I did NA for three years. I have done NA like sporadically since then. It's not necessarily the best way for me to recover. I found that the longer I was in NA, the more I wanted to use. When I first started going to NA, it did help a lot. So I would never tell someone not to go. I would just say be careful, because for me, listening to people, as I had more clean time underneath me, listening to people talk about how hard it was to stay clean, or people that were coming in from relapses, it was very hard for me to not use, because I felt like it was constantly still around me, even though I was supposed to be doing things to recover, right? So I have fully worked the steps one time, and I think that's enough for me. I know some people will work the steps for like the rest of their lives. I'm not that person, but I'm never a person who's going to tell you not to do NA. I'm not a person who's going to like shame you for not doing it either. I don't necessarily think that NA is for everybody. So I did NA, and then during that time, Ari's biological father, I'm not gonna say his name on the internet, because you could look him up, and he has quite a record at this point. So he came over into the street team program. So we got to know each other a little bit better. He, I think, had around 18 months clean. Technically, when you're in NA, you're not supposed to date within your first year. I did not listen to that, which, whatever. I don't regret things. I just look back on them and I'm like, that wasn't a great choice, but it is what it is. He and I ended up moving out of Salvation Army like three-ish months into our relationship, I think, because Mr. Don had noticed that we were dating. Like, we tried to be like undercover about it, but we weren't good at it. And he said to me, well, he pulled us both into his office one day and he said, listen, y'all are not supposed to be dating in the program, which is true, we weren't. And he said, but if that's what you guys want to do, then I'm going to have to ask you to leave. Now, the way that this worked was, because I had food stamps, he was working at that time. That didn't last very long, but he was working at that time. So when we moved out, we did have some money, so we ended up moving out. I was still going and visiting my kids every weekend. So what I would do is on Saturday mornings, I would take a bus from Daytona to where they lived. I'm not gonna tell you where they lived, but I would take a bus from Daytona to where they lived. It was about an hour bus ride. Because then what I would do is I would go see them in the morning, and then in the afternoon I had set up because so at this time I'm on probation, right? The kids are already with their mom, right? They're already in the foster placement. So there were things that I had to do for my case plan for the court, but there were also things I had to do for my case plan for probation because I was criminally charged. So I was on probation. I'm very open about the fact that I was on probation. It is what it is. I was on there for 5 years. However, within the first year, I had to take this like drug and alcohol class. It was basically like DARE, but for adults. Okay, so I had to pay for this. It was like $100 per session or something. Like, it was an astronomical amount of money to me at that time. I had people that were helping me pay for it. Like, there were a few friends that I had made in like these different programs that were helping me to pay for things because I was having trouble paying for everything, and that just was what it was. I had stayed in a different program. I didn't stay there very long, which is why I didn't really talk about this other program, but I had stayed in another program between like the overnight program at Salvation Army and the street team. I stayed at another place that required you to like, I got food stamps, so they would require that like you buy your own, that you help pay for bulk items, so meat, cheese, eggs, and milk, and then like cereals and stuff like that. And then you also would have to buy like your own snacks and like toiletries and stuff like that. So that program, you had to have some kind of income coming in. I was doing YouTube at that time. I was actually doing planning YouTube at that point. And so I was getting, and I was selling digital planners. So I was getting some kickback is through my Etsy shop. I wasn't making a ton. That Etsy shop no longer exists, so you won't be able to find it. But I was probably making $200 a month on the Etsy shop at that point. And so I was able to use that to kind of like live on or whatever. It wasn't very much, but it was a little bit. So and plus I was still like filing my taxes and things like that. So I stayed there, but I only stayed there for 6 months. And then I got a call saying that I had gotten into the Salvation Army program. So that's why I didn't really talk about that, because I didn't stay there very long. But so I had made some friends at that program that were helping me pay for this drug and alcohol thing, because I still had to also buy my own things. Like, I had to buy my own food, I had to buy, clothes and stuff like that if I needed them. So I would go see my kids in the mornings on Saturdays, and then I would take this drug and alcohol class, and then I would go home to raise dad. So eventually I got pregnant. I think had been together like 6 months, and with Ari I knew I was pregnant. It's like, I woke up one day and I was like, I feel that I'm pregnant. Like, that was like literally my reaction. And so I took a test. I hadn't missed my cycle yet, so I was like, it could come back negative, but it didn't. It came back positive. So I was living with him. Now he did meet my kids because at that point, like, we were having a kid together, and we'd been together over 6 months, and I let it be the choice of as to whether he met the kids or not, because at that point I was just going by myself. I had told her that I was pregnant because I'm a very small person, and back then I was even smaller, so I couldn't hide it. Like, after the first trimester, there was no hiding it. So I had told her, like, I am pregnant, blah blah. She said okay. He and I were living on our own at that point. We were in an apartment, and so when I first got pregnant, we had been living like like in a room. In Florida, there's a lot of places where you can like rent a room, and then it's like you and a bunch of roommates in this house. You rent a room from the homeowner. Sometimes the homeowner also lives in the house. In this situation, she didn't. But then you share things like if they have a pool, you can share the pool, you share the bathrooms, you share the kitchen and the living room. So we mostly stayed in our room, outside of like using the pool, the laundry area, and the kitchen. We had a TV in our room, so there was really no reason for me to be like out in the living room. Also, I'm pretty sure that most of the people in that house were addicts and like actively using. He and I were not using. At least I don't think he was. I know I wasn't. I was pregnant. I'm pretty sure this was before his relapse that we stayed there, because I'm pretty sure that his relapse did happen at our apartment. I know that he started using at our apartment. So it started with like alcohol and then like beer, and then it went into, I was pretty sure he was using drugs, which he was. So that whole relationship was very tumultuous. He was very abusive, and it was by far, I mean, I have been in other like DV situations, and I have been in other like abusive relationships. This relationship was extremely terrible. Like it was really bad. It was like to a point where he and I were still together, but he wasn't coming around the kids anymore because like I was always making an excuse. He had to work, he didn't feel well, whatever, because I knew he was using. He wouldn't tell me he was using, but I knew he was, and I could not have him around the children that were with A. I didn't have a lot of choice in the situation I was in, because with him being around Ari. And for most of the time that we were together, I was pregnant anyways. Because then once Ari was actually born, he would just leave to do whatever he was doing. And then he would come back and he'd be up for like 3 or 5 days because he was using methamphetamine. And so that makes you stay up for hours. So then it became that I was clean from drugs, but the abuse had turned me back into an addict. I don't know how to really explain this to someone or to anyone who has never been in an abusive relationship or has never been a drug addict. But sometimes drug addicts will quit actual drugs, but then they find a different addiction. And unfortunately, my survival became my addiction. So trying to keep the peace with him, because at that point, like, Ari was born and everything like that, but it had been physically abusive for a while. I ended up with a split lip at one point. He didn't punch me or anything, but I ended up with a split lip. The kids were adopted during this time. Like, I went through the adoption process during this time. And those pictures, I usually post a couple of pictures over on my Instagram. If you want to go look at those, I usually write, like, there will be a post that's up with pictures from that. I was very pregnant with Ari because they were adopted in March, and they were adopted at the end of March, and Ari was born in the middle of May, because we didn't quite make the 60-day threshold, and so I ended up having to deal with DCF. Nothing came of it, but I had a 30-day case with them when Ari was born, just because we didn't hit the 60-day threshold with their adoption. But that went fine. It was fine. But on the adoption day, he had hit me in the face with something, a belt or his shirt, I don't remember, but we got into a fight on adoption day after I had gotten back from it. He accused me of, like, not being at the adoption. Stupid. Anyway, he had split my lip open. So that was kind of a problem, because at that time I talked to a lot of my family members through FaceTime, so I had to try to hide that for like 2 weeks while it healed. And then after Ari was born, the physical abuse got worse. So I was already dealing with mental health stuff and was on medication for it, but because of the fact that I feared for my life, and he did attempt to take my life twice. My PTSD ended up manifesting into CPTSD. So I actually have both. I've been diagnosed with both. My PTSD stems mostly from childhood traumas. My CPTSD stems from him. So that was like a whole thing. So during this time, I'm also navigating, the kids were adopted. This was a very, I'm not gonna get emotional, this was a very hard time for me. Because actually my timeline, yeah, okay. So the adoption paperwork was signed months prior to me being with Ariana's biological dad. So the way that adoption works in Florida anyway, or at least how it worked for me, I signed the adoption paperwork in January of 2015. They were not adopted until March of 2015. So he and I were not together in January. So, I'm trying to think how this worked. Were we together in January? I'm sorry. The paperwork was signed January of... Okay, so Ari was born in 2015. I got pregnant with her in August of 2014, right? Yes, so I got pregnant with Ari August 2014. The paperwork was signed at the end or the beginning of at the end of 2013 or the beginning of 2014. I think it was signed in January of 2014 because almost an entire year went past before the kids were, or over a year went past before the kids were adopted. Because basically what happened was I said I will not sign my rights over for them to be adopted until the dads are stripped of their rights. If the dads still had their rights, they could have come in and split the kids up. And I did not want the children split up. At that point, they had been in the care of A for 18 months and they'd always been together. They did not know life without each other. So H and G's dad had failed to show up to court. His rights were stripped involuntarily. C's dad signed his rights over and then left the courtroom. I remember the day that he did that. And then I went in at a later date and I signed my rights over. That was a very hard time for me. I signed my rights. The day that the paperwork was signed was that night was my relapse, okay? So a whole year, over a year has gone past since I've signed the rights over. I technically have no rights to my children at this point. However, A was still allowing for visits because we had agreed on an open adoption. We have an open adoption to this day. And so, yeah. So adoption day came in 2015. Adoption day was March of 2015. And I went to that, and like the caseworker that we had, she drove me there, and I was very pregnant with Ari. And then that night, the physical abuse started. So that was where my lip got split. That was the first instance. However, once Ari was born, the abuse got worse. And so there were times where, at that point he wasn't seeing the kids at all, but there were times that I would have to like call and cancel because I couldn't show up to her house looking the way I did. I knew that it would be like a thing. I was wearing some makeup at that time to cover bruises and stuff like that. It was a very like tumultuous time for me, and I definitely stayed in that relationship for a year longer than I should have because it's very scary to leave a DV situation, especially when it is a physical one, because it is true, like what they say. First of all, it can take up to 7 times. It did not take me 7 times. I never actually left. Like, there was no actual leaving. There was planning to leave. There was no actual leaving. Also, to anyone who might be in my real life that's watching this, I'm purposely not giving a lot of detail about what transpired because I've not shared it with people in my actual life when it came to that relationship, because I don't need anyone trying to like hunt this man down and like doing something to him, because he's not worth anyone going to jail for. So there's that. So at this time, I'm navigating the big feelings that come with having your children adopted. I was in a few support groups. I was also finding that the stigma around birth parents is crazy. Everyone assumes that if you have chosen to place your children for adoption, that means that you're a drug addict or a teenage mother, like a teenage parent. And that's not true. There are 1,000,001 reasons why people place their children for adoption. I am an advocate for birth mothers specifically, but I will advocate for birth parents in general. Statistically, there are far fewer birth fathers that go as far as to need to be advocated for. The only time that I really have advocated for birth fathers is when it is a situation of the birth parents are married. So there's a birth mom and a birth dad that are married, and they've chosen to give their children up for adoption. Or I don't like saying it that way. They've chosen to place their children for adoption or child for adoption due to like economical reasons. So like they can't afford the child, or I have advocated for birth parents who were doing what they thought they were supposed to do as far as like protecting themselves against pregnancy, knowing that they were not able to care for a child. Mom got pregnant, and then mom and dad said, okay, well, unfortunately, we already have 2 children. This was a real situation, and we can't take care of a third. We're going to have to just put them, place them for adoption. And in that situation, they actually told their children, I don't know if they were ever honest with their children later, it's not my business. Their children were relatively small when she got pregnant with the third. And so I do know that they had told their 2 children they already had that this baby was not their baby, that this baby was given to them. They were religious. So it was given to them by God to give to a family that couldn't have a baby. So they already had like their people picked out, like their the people they were placing their baby with. They already had them picked out, but it's still a process. There's still a lot of grief, even when you're doing something like surrogacy, right? Which is just like consensual adoption. Like that, in my opinion, you are still growing a baby. So it is still like you still have the bond of like growing this baby and stuff like that. There are some measures that they take with adoption when you know that that's what your end goal is, right? So one of the things that you can advocate for or help to advocate for is for of course this has to be consensual between all parties, but the couple that I was just talking about, where they knew they couldn't take care of a third child, so they had already picked out like their adopted parents and everything, the birth mom chose not to be the first to hold the baby. I actually don't know that she ever held the baby, and they did not name that baby. The adopted parents named them, and the adopted mom was the first person to hold the baby. So adoption takes a toll on your mental health. So I had already been dealing with some mental health things. I have been diagnosed with PTSD, now CPTSD as well, anxiety, depression, and yeah, and I'm also like on the spectrum. So I was already dealing with which being on the spectrum is not mental health, but you know what I mean. I'd already been dealing with some mental health things, and then once the adoption went through, so the adoption was technically already through, but once we did like the actual adoption like ceremony thing at the court, it was very real to me. I knew that a relapse was not an option that time, obviously, but I did struggle. There's a lot of like guilt behind it. There's a lot of like, why couldn't you take care of your kids there were some family members for me that were not very supportive. They claimed to be, but they were not. There were a few that I did not speak to for literal months because I just, like, they would tell me, like, you took the easy way out. What a way to just not want to take care of your kids. That was not the case at all. I actually fought really hard for those 18 months to get the kids back. And unfortunately, with the services and stuff that they needed, I was not equipped to give them that. Their mom is much more equipped to give them that. They were better off being there. However, it also has shaped being involved with her, and watching her as a parent has truly shaped who I am as a parent. I raised Ari the way that I do in large part because I never wanted to be like my mom, my mother. She was not great. She was also a narcissist, so like there's that, like diagnosed. So narcissistic personality disorder. So I was always afraid that I would end up getting that from her. I've been evaluated for that. I don't have a narcissistic personality disorder. I have other things to deal with, but not that. But I knew I never wanted to parent like that, but I didn't know what like the ideal parenting looked like to me until I met A and I watched her parent. So a lot of my parenting style with Ari has to do with her with A's influence on me. And I do find this to be hard to talk about because I don't think that people take into consideration the emotional and mental toll that it takes to place your children for adoption. One of the biggest things for me was that I'm not gonna get emotional. There was so much guilt. Like even now, I find myself sometimes having guilt around it. Even though I was doing the best I could at the time, and I do the best I can now, and we have pretty regular contact with the kids. They do go to like a boarding school during the school year, so the contact with them is mostly holidays, and then like I get them sometimes for like a week in the summer. But the guilt that I feel sometimes is crazy sauce. Like it's really crazy. And my kids, all of them know that they're siblings. Ari will never tell you that they're not her siblings. They've grown up together their whole lives. They've, you know, to her, A is just an extension of the family. She calls A mama as well. So the way that this works, people ask me this because it's an adoption. All the kids call A mama and then her name, her full name. They call me mom or mommy and then Neva, except Ari, who just calls me mom. But the three boys call me mom or mommy Neva. That's just how it's always been. If A had told me they can't call you mom anymore, okay, because in my opinion, I'm their birth mom. Like I brought them to this earth. I was God's given vessel to birth them, but she is their mom. But that just is what it is. So the guilt behind it, I think people assume that when children are placed for adoption, that the birth parents don't care, that they don't feel anything. It doesn't hurt them. It's almost like we're not human beings. We are human beings. And in most circumstances that I have seen, even when drugs are the catalyst to the reason that children are placed for adoption, there is guilt there. There is sadness. There is mourning. There is loss. And I think that if there's anything that you can take from, oh my God, I'm not gonna cry. If there's anything that you can take from this video, it's to be kind to people in your life that you know are birth parents. Because even if you feel like they don't show it the way that they should, I can almost guarantee that there is some negative feeling there. There's guilt or there's loss. Some people have resentment for a while, but it's the stages of grief, right? It's still a loss there. And as a person who, I do it very quietly. So until now, a lot of people don't know that I advocate for birth moms. I'm talking to birth parents all the time because I'm part of a few, they're volunteer organizations, but I'm part of a couple of organizations. I have some friends who also are foster parents that will say, hey, they'll reach out to me and say, hey, are you willing to talk to this parent? They're having a hard time or whatever. And I had to figure out how to advocate for myself in the court, and that's hard to do. And so I told myself, when these children are adopted, you need to advocate for other parents. You need to help other parents to navigate the court system, to navigate the adoption process, to navigate all of those things. I've had to learn like adoption laws in other states because some of these parents that I talk to are not from states that I've lived in or that I do live in. And it's hard. Like it's a hard thing. And I think that there's still, actually, I'm pretty sure that there's still like a shame around having your children be placed for adoption. And I don't know that anyone will really watch this video that's outside of like my, my normal demographic. But if someone new sees this, even one person, and you are struggling with this, you're contemplating placing a child for adoption, you've placed a child for adoption and you're feeling guilty about it, or maybe you know someone who's had a child adopted, or maybe you just look down on people who place their children for adoption, just know that in almost every situation, it's a selfless act. It is the act of knowing that we were not enough for that child or those children at that time. And so the best option was for them to go not with us. And that's a hard realization, honestly, because it takes reevaluating your pride and putting your pride aside in order to give a child or multiple children the best life they can have. And sometimes it's much more like, if we were acting just on pride, we would just keep them. We would just keep raw dogging it and just say, we can do this even when we're drowning. And I think that because there's such a stigma still, and there's such like this weird shame around not being equipped to take care of children that you've given birth to, so you find someone who can give them the care and the services or whatever it is that they need. There's such a weird shame around it that people don't talk about it. So, okay, I'm not gonna cry. I'm almost done. So, this has been a very long video. It's been over an hour, and it's probably just gonna go up the way that it is. There's not a lot for me to edit here. So, if you've taken anything from this, if you've watched to the end, first of all, I appreciate you. Share like an emoji down below, a heart or something, if you've watched, oh gosh, to the end. But just know that I hope that one day the stigma around adoption is lifted. It's worked on, because I don't think that there's shame in adoption. In most instances, is actually a really beautiful thing. Even if it's a closed adoption, even if the parents and the adopted parents decide, the birth parents and the adopted parents decide to close that door, and that the birth parents no longer ever have any contact with that child ever again, it's still a beautiful thing. And yes, there are circumstances, of course, where children are adopted into terrible families. But statistically, that's much less than the children that are adopted into wonderful families. And I do know that if it hadn't been for the family that my children were adopted into, I don't know where we would be at this point, to be honest. Not well off, I can tell you that. So I feel like this was very rambly, but if you watched till the end, thank you for watching. I don't know really how to close this out because I feel like my normal outro is weird. But if this video helps one person, even makes one person feel a little bit less alone in their journey of adoption, my like social media links are down below. I'm always up to talk to people who've had children adopted and are struggling with it, or they need an advocate. You can reach out to me. I don't have like advocate services or anything like that, but I can at least be a sounding board and I can help you find services if that's what you're needing. But I'm going to go now. So thank you so much for watching. If you've made it this far, leave me some kind of like heart emoji down below. And we'll be back to regular content very soon. And happy birth Mother's Day to those who observe it. And happy Mother's Day to those who will be celebrating that tomorrow. And also, if you're struggling on birth Mother's Day or on Mother's Day, me too. And it'll be okay and you're not alone. So, love you guys so much.